SuperTutor, transforming one life at a time. About 18 months ago, I worked with a young boy called James Killops. He is autistic, ADHD and dyslexic. This is his story.
James is 12. I had a normal pregnancy, a healthy baby, happy baby. When he got to about 18 months, I started realizing that he wasn't necessarily like other children his age. Just he was extremely hyperactive. My biggest frustration was that his speech wasn't developing. He was very verbal, but his own language, very like gobbledygook. So I took him to a speech therapist, and she just said, you know what, there's massive delays here, but there's other issues as well. He's very obsessed on certain topics, dragons, for example. She couldn't get him to engage in anything unless it was dragons. Also the hyperactivity. So I then took him to a specialist who diagnosed ADHD. He was 4, but formal school was just traumatic. Trying to get him out the car in the morning, he'd sort of claw the car. We literally have to pry his hands from the headrest. We then took him to an educational psychologist who, reading that report was, I just cried. It was basically 15 pages of everything that was wrong with my child. He's very, very bright. And people who don't know him might comment that he's different and strange, but they will always comment on his intelligence. It's very obvious. You know, he couldn't write. His early pre-writing developed, but it never went further than that. So he would pretend to be a T-Rex because he'd had short arms, and then he couldn't write. So he just wouldn't write for a week because he was a T-Rex. And I refused to accept that this is just the way it's going to be. And I started researching, looking at, the bigger symptoms. And the more I looked it up, the more the word Asperger's syndrome came up, which I then found out was a form of autism, and apparently they don't even use that word anymore. It's now just high-functioning autism. We then went to see a child psychiatrist, and she came to easy conclusion. It would have been a diagnosis of what was then Asperger's. But I realized, he was now 8, and he was not reading at all, nothing. He would write his name, but very badly, sometimes backwards. The letter formation was mirrored. It was very poor, but that was basically the only word he could recognize and write. Even familiar names, my name, mom, dad, there was nothing. But remedial schools generally wouldn't touch James because he was grade 5 age, but reading on a grade 1 level. And in 2014, I had a little girl named Sydney in my class, and found out that her mom was a reading specialist and helped children with reading issues. And I contacted her, Val, and said, do you think you could help my son? What I always appreciated about Val from the beginning is her honesty. She said she'd recently found out about the Davis program. She was also just, skimming the top. She didn't know the details yet, but there were children she had been working with who had done it, and when they'd come back, there'd been such a remarkable improvement. Now, everything we'd been through with James, including there's also doctors and specialists and medication and OT and speech therapy and play therapy. I mean, we were totally broke. I sort of felt, I've done everything. It's just another gimmick. I'd done edu-blocks. I'd done the special eye training that you do at the doctors to help with the optometrist to help with the scanning. If there was something out there, Dore, I've done it, and it didn't work. And they promise you the world, and they say, they're going to fix everything, and your child's going to, have a different life. And I get that in some cases, maybe. But I know that in my child, I was dealing with possibly the worst level of dyslexia you could deal with. Totally illiterate.
Previously, I didn't know how to read. I had a major block of reading. I forgot what it's called, but I managed to break through thanks to the Davis program.
Val, it was actually Val who told Nicola about the workshop in Cape Town, and Nicola being a school teacher and the mom of this beautiful little autistic, dyslexic, you name it, little boy, and said to her, you have to come. because I'm going to this Davis program workshop in Cape Town. Nicola went with Val, and 3 or 4 days into that workshop, even though we had been messaging each other in between when she had a chance, the off times, and she said, "Mom, I have found somebody who's going to help James."
And I did the 4-day Davis program in Komaki. But again, a part of me was saying, you know, this must just be too good to be true because, you know, been there, done that. But another half thinking, you know, what if it really is what it says it is? So February 2015, James did what was supposed to be 5 days, but ended up being 10, mainly because it took 3 days just to get him to not try and rip hair out of your beard and just be a creature of the night and all the things that James is, just to get him to just participate. By day 3, I suddenly saw a change in my child. And he was recognizing his alphabet, which was a huge thing. He would one day see an A as an A, and then he'd think it's an E, and then an E. He didn't know. Where suddenly he knew A, B, C, D. And I could point to it out of sequence, so it wasn't that he'd parroted it. Even backwards, he'd come to grips with his alphabet, which was a massive, massive step. And I was very realistic going into this because I've taught for years. I knew that because of the degree of his dyslexia, he was not going to do 5 days and suddenly pick up a novel and be comfortable with reading. My big thing was to see those children who are dyslexic but functionally literate. They could still read, but with difficulty. That's where you see miracles really happen. And I've seen it with children that have done it since with Val, and I've seen the difference in the classroom. And now my husband, so he doesn't always know what we're dealing with, but even he noticed the change in James instantly. Don't get me wrong, James is still not picking up books and reading confidently, but I think a lot has got to do with the emotional walls that were put up in his early days, because he reads so much more than he thinks he can. Because often there'll be signs where he'll go, "Mom, how come they don't allow children past that point?" Because there's a sign that says no children past this point. But because I haven't said what does the sign say, and then, "Oh no, I can't read it," he's read it because he glanced at it and he could make it out.
But now I'm reading Charlotte's Web.
He is reading from his school reader, which is Charlotte's Web, so it's not a grade 1 reader. But yes, he has to practice the page over and over, but once he's practiced it a few times, he will read it. He types perfectly. He now WhatsApps family members, and they can understand what he's saying. It's very phonetic, so his spelling is horrific, but they still know. He's saying, "Hey, Gran, what are you doing today? Can I come and visit?" She can make out what he's saying.
One day I think he had a little bit of a interaction with a friend and decided he felt a bit lonely and wondered why nobody wanted to be his friend. And he was sitting on the couch and I was at my laptop, and he said, "Granny, please can you type something for me, because I want to tell a story." And the story about the lion and the penguin came up, and I think it was basically just to explain how he felt isolated and alone and nobody wanted to be his friend. So he read off this whole story from his mind, and I sat there typing. And that was his story, The Lion and the Penguin.
A Lion of the Penguin is about one lion and one penguin. They didn't have any friends, and they found each other and they made friends.
I would find reams of things in his school books that he would do if he had free time at school. He'd be sitting writing, sometimes not perfectly, because you can see the little bit of dyslexia in there, but he knows what he's saying and I can work out what he's saying, but it would be pages and pages and pages, almost like he didn't know when to stop, which is a great thing. He's always getting up to mischief. If I'm in my bedroom and I can hear him moving around in the kitchen, I have to go and check to see what he's doing. So that has changed a lot. He's become more, he listens now. When you say no, it's no. no means no, and he understands now. And he's started to understand consequence as well.
Inadvertently, the autism side of things, even though that wasn't our main goal at the time, because for me as a teacher, an English teacher as such, just wants him to read, that was my big focus, it actually ended up being the secondary win, where his autism traits were just, I try to think of the word, he just found himself. He found that he was a unique individual human being, and he was different, but that's okay. And he could start to see other people's points of view a little clearer.
Before, a lot of people used to think he was this horrible child who just had tantrums all the time. Nobody actually knew what his problem was. I don't think he even knew himself. And once Nicola had walked this mile, or 10 miles, and found the help that she got from you and the Davis program, everything just seemed to change. It just seemed to fall into place.
Where you are dealing with the most dyslexic that you can deal with, I think what we've achieved in not even 18 months has been remarkable. And I don't believe that any of this would have happened if we had not done those 10 days. I think those 10 days made all the difference between us being where we are and the success that we're experiencing now, and how James is just flourishing as a little individual and feeling worthwhile and not feeling stupid. And that's also where I've been so fortunate, because we've realized going through this how dyslexic and also autistic my husband is, and how unfairly life treated him back in the 70s and 80s when he was schooled because of people's lack of understanding. He couldn't do any of those things. He's had to work through the system to finally now at age 46 be recognized as an engineer. But he's done it because he's in an area that he thrives and his intelligence is obvious. But at school he failed twice. So he matriculated at 21. I've seen his matric certificate. It was like F's, G's and F's. He was just basically thrown aside as the stupid one, where anybody who actually spends time with him will realize how bright he is. In fact, his IQ test that came out of the woodwork years later, he's 142. And me working in a gifted school, I know that that is beyond what is considered normal gifted. That is exceptional. But in the school system, he was the dunce. It's now my turn, because we've kind of got through the worst of it. I know we've got a long way to go, but the worst is behind me. It's now my turn, and I reach back and sort of help people across that void. But yeah, you can get there.
Gifted Dyslexic. Learning made easy. www.gifteddyslexic.com